Hello and welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us tonight. We often hear that 97% of scientists agree, and the science is settled. Climate change is an existential threat. Serious actions and numerous laws have been enacted to combat it, sometimes even with serious debilitating consequences like farmers being unable to produce enough food or energy supplies being limited. Nonetheless, governments are planning further restrictions in an effort to combat the climate change emergency. And like COVID and other topics that are allowed only one narrative, it's difficult to even question things without being called a conspiracy theorist. Well, today we will talk to an actual climate scientist who can bring some balance to the conversation about if climate change is an emergency or another manufactured crisis to excuse more authoritarian control over the population. Judith Curry is the president and founder of the Climate Forecast Application Network and professor emerita of the Georgia Institute of Technology with a PhD in geophysical science. Judith was the former chairperson and former professor of the School of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences at the Georgia Institute of Technology before she resigned in 2017, citing the craziness of climate science. During the Obama administration, she criticized the climate alarmists for trying to employ unhelpful policies. Judith's questioning of the emergency nature of climate change earned her a title by Scientific American publication saying that she was a climate heretic who had turned on her colleagues. What's interesting is Judith does believe climate change is happening, and she believes humans are even contributing to it. She just says it's not an emergency to the level the alarmists are making it out to be. Sounds familiar? Now, despite the mainstream pushback, Judith has continued to speak up. She's written several books, including Climate Uncertainty and Risk, Rethinking Our Response, which comes out in June. Now, before we get to the interview with Judith, let me tell you about our great sponsor, Birch Gold. You can invest and diversify out away from maybe your current investments that you're in. If you're feeling like things are a bit uncertain with the economy, you don't know where inflation is headed, you think your retirement account is kind of dwindling away, well, Birch Gold can help you diversify into gold and other precious metals. All you have to do is go to birchgold.com/Kim to get your free info kit, and a specialist will contact you, and they can walk you through what is best for you when it comes to diversifying into precious metals. So maybe you want to own some gold physically that you keep in your house. You could do that, or maybe you want to even just convert your current 401ks and IRA into an IRA in precious metals where real gold and silver is backing that investment for you. So you can contact that specialist. Just go to birchgold.com/Kim, and you're going to get that info kit, and a specialist will get to you. So again, that's birchgold.com/Kim to get that free info kit. Dr. Judith Curry, it is so great to have you on the show. Welcome.
Thanks, Kim. Thanks for inviting me.
Okay, so let's start off. Is climate change real? Is this happening in your perspective?
Well, the climate has changed for the entire 4.6 billion years of the Earth's history. It varies and changes all the time on many different timescales. Over the past 100 years or so, humans have contributed to climate change through emissions, burning of fossil fuels, and also through land use.
So how much would you say, if you were to give a percentage to this, how much would you say that humans are contributing to climate change?
Well, it's really hard to know because the IPCC has defined their assessments totally in context of dangerous human-caused climate change, and natural climate change has been completely marginalized. So there's widespread disagreement about how much of it is natural. The science hasn't been investigating the sun climate connections sufficiently. We pay insufficient attention to the large scale ocean circulations and things like that. So we really don't know. I mean, just for a rough number, I would say half human caused, half natural caused over
But
the
that's
last.
quite a bit. I mean, if it's half, then wouldn't it
We don't,
be?
half plus or minus 30%. It could be as low as 20%. Some people think it's 100%. We really don't know.
So
But
the 97% of scientists, right, who say, they give us this number that 97% of scientists agree that humans are the number one driver of climate change.
No,
So,
that's not what the agreement is on. Okay, let me clarify this whole
sure.
97% canard. That was derived from a group of activist scientists who looked at abstracts of published papers and found that 97% of climate-related papers either assumed human-caused global warming or were discussing it. Okay, the point is, there's nothing about how much of it. Everyone agrees that humans are contributing something to the warming. The question is how much. So the 97% is highly exaggerated and its meaning is extended into all sorts of things. It doesn't include 100% warming. It doesn't include dangerous warming or anything like that. There's still widespread disagreement amongst the scientific community on the most fundamental issues.
So you've been labeled as a climate change denier, and you've said that you just wanted to get away from the climate craziness, right? The craziness of climate science, and that's why you ultimately left Georgia Institute of Technology. What is the craziness that you're seeing, and why would they then say you're a denier of that craziness?
Okay, you have to go back to 2009, 2010, when some emails were hacked from the University of East Anglia Climate Research Unit. Um, this was called Climate Gate, if anyone remembers. And I called out a lot of really bad behavior was revealed, trying to evade Freedom of Information Act requests, trying to get editors of journals fired, trying to circumvent the IPCC process, on it goes. And I called out those scientists, say we need to do better. Okay, we need to be transparent. We need to make our data available. We need to be clear about the uncertainties in what we're doing. And we need to be respectful of scientists and other people who question or challenge our findings. And these are the statements that I made. And this upset a lot of people who were caught out by the ClimateGate emails. And they figured the best way of dealing with me was to call me a denier. That way I would be dismissed and I would be thrown into the other camp. No serious climate scientist who isn't an activist with a political agenda would ever refer to me as a denier. It's really a political term that activists find convenient to label me with because I ask uncomfortable questions.
What is, do you think, the most uncomfortable question that when you bring it up, this is where things really get tense for you?
Oh my gosh, all over the place. About the attribution issue, I talk about natural climate variability and how people aren't paying sufficient attention to this. I talk about how this so-called consensus is a politically manufactured one. It's not a real scientific consensus. It's a consensus of scientists that have been carefully picked by politicians to promote a particular agenda. It's not a true scientific consensus. If we're talking about does the Earth orbit the sun, we don't need to talk about a consensus because that's a well-known fact. It's only when things are very uncertain and people are trying to promote a truth to power kind of situation that they're motivated to manufacture a consensus like has been done for the climate change issue.
So, so you do say that humans have contributed quite a bit to this. So if it's as low as 20% or if it's as high as 50% when it comes to climate, then wouldn't that constitute, I suppose, some sort of emergency or some sort of we do need to do as much as we can rapidly. I mean, we're seeing governments around the world banning, gas engine cars. We're seeing, this rapid kind of evolution towards a new form of energy, and they're saying that we're in a climate emergency. It's a crisis. We're all going to become extinct here in the next couple of, maybe even as little as 15 years or 10 years, which does seem a bit far-fetched, quite honestly. I feel like I've heard this for a couple of decades now that we're going to be extinct in 15 years, and yet here we still are. and we're growing. The population just keeps increasing. So what is, if it is that high, I mean, that does seem still like a really high number, that 20 to 50% of climate of the change being attributed to human behavior or human consumption or output of these greenhouse gases. So what is the appropriate response then?
Okay, the weakest part of the whole argument is whether warming is dangerous. Okay, we're talking about 2 degrees Fahrenheit of warming since about 1900. I mean, this isn't very much. I mean, it's far less than, day-to-day warming. It's not very much. Carbon dioxide has been greening the planet. Um, is this a bad thing? The preferences in the United States, anyways, people are leaving northern states and moving to Florida, Texas, and Arizona. They don't like warm winters. So the weakest part of the argument is whether warming is dangerous. They've attempted to say all these, all extreme weather events are related to warming. Well, the observations simply don't show that. And even the IPCC reports claim very little impact from the warming on extreme weather events other than heat waves. And when you do, it's not like the warming causes more heat waves. It's when you get a big heat wave, it might be a degree or two warmer than it otherwise might have been. So, where's the danger? There's a slow creep of sea level rise, which has been increasing since about 1850. The rate of change of the sea level rise has accelerated a little bit, but it was also accelerating around the 1940s. So there's a lot of natural variability involved. And, the issue is regardless of how much humans are contributing, where's the danger? For something like the slow creep of global warming, you can easily normalize your response. Over the past 50 years or so, damages from extreme weather when scaled by gross domestic product has decreased substantially. The number of lives lost from extreme weather events has decreased by 97%. So I ask, where's the danger? I mean, it's not a good thing just to keep dumping stuff into the atmosphere, but to talk about existential crisis and all this other nonsense is, well, just nonsense.
So very interesting. So you do think humans are contributing quite a bit. I mean, I would say 20 to 50% is quite a bit to climate change. But then you say, yeah, but it does, but it's such a minor amount that it's not actually this grand emergency. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, but not only that, nobody's really established what's wrong with warming. What is wrong with a warmer climate? That's a question to me that still remains unanswered. Mm.
I guess that is a good question. I suppose that is a good question. Can people, like, let's kind of go back to the basics, I suppose, on this, because this is a very confusing topic for most of us. Most of us are not scientists. That is why we gobble it up. When they say when they, the ominous they, when the news media comes out and says there's nearly 100% agreement by scientists that humans are causing climate change. There's nearly 100% agreement that this is an existential threat that is going to cause extinction. There's a nearly 100% consensus on this, that we must do something about this now, that this is no longer, they started off with calling it, I don't remember exactly the order. Did it start off, was it called global warming and then climate change, or was it climate change and then global warming? What are we
It
calling
was
it now?
global warming, then climate change, then the climate crisis, and the climate emergency, then existential threat, and on it goes. The rhetoric continues to become increasingly apocalyptic, even as the warming projections, come down. Um,
Right.
Not only the climate crisis isn't what it used to be, even if you're strictly going by the IPCC reports. They've now, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Conference of Parties, this is the international group that meets every year to discuss all this stuff. They are no longer considering the most extreme emissions scenarios. Okay, they've dropped that from consideration. They're looking at the medium emission scenarios. And it's these extreme emission scenarios that are featured prominently in the IPCC reports that most of the climate impacts literature is driven by these extreme emissions scenario with all these crazy, oh, all these terrible things could happen. It's driven by emission scenarios that are now widely regarded to be implausible. But nevertheless, the rhetoric keeps ramping up, and it just absolutely makes no sense.
Okay, so let's kind of go back to the beginning of just how the Earth changes naturally, and the various cycles of the Earth. I haven't done a lot of research on climate. This is a big topic, a lot of science on this. But what I've learned, over the years is that the Earth has gone through these various different changes. That we've had ice ages where the Earth was frozen over in ice. There were times that the Earth had no ice on it. It was completely green, where Antarctica, underneath must have some like lush tropical land. And that the Earth kind of naturally goes through all of these various phases. Where are we? From my understanding, we're in an ice age or a type of an ice age, and the Earth is just naturally exiting out of this ice age, and we're naturally going to be going into a warmer climate naturally, and that at some point, I don't know how many thousands of years from now, there will be no ice at all on the planet. Is that something that, I mean, am I getting this right?
Okay, well, sort of up until just the last statements. I mean, where we're headed, we've probably peaked. The interglacial warmth has probably peaked about 5,000 years ago. And, we're in a slow cooling phase, and the greenhouse warming from emitting fossil fuels has turned the corner a little bit on that. Um, so, I mean, at some point, on a time scale of thousands of years, we would be headed back towards another ice age. The question is on those kind of time scales, is emitting fossil fuels a good thing, to delay future ice ages? So but we're at this point, we probably wouldn't be on, like, say, 1,000-year timescales, we probably wouldn't be warming. But, on, say, decadal kinds of timescales, there's volcanic eruptions, there's large-scale ocean circulations, there's shorter-term, solar cycles, all sorts of things going on in the natural climate system, that conspire to give us a lot of year to year and decade to decade variability in the climate. And the slow creep of warming and any change to extreme weather events or sea level rise is very hard to sort out from the natural climate variability. I mean, a lot of what we're based on, all of this alarm is based on climate model predictions of what's going to happen in the future. And by the way, attempts to blame every extreme weather event on human caused global warming, which is ridiculous. In the US, extreme weather was much worse in the 1930s than anything we've seen in the 21st century. The worst heat waves, even, the worst uh, forest fires in the West, the worst droughts, and so on. We saw much worse weather in the 30s and even the 1950s. And what we're seeing right now is, maybe a tiny bit worse than what we saw in the 70s and 80s and 90s, but that's part of a natural variability cycle. So, it's very hard to tease out the
Right.
impacts of this 2 degrees warming on something that we can actually sense.
Well, I think the reason why I'm bringing up the Earth cycles and the change and the shift of the Earth is that the Earth is not always, from my understanding, habitable for humans. That there have been times on the that where humans just could not exist on the planet, or very few humans. So if we were to go into another ice age where the Earth is completely covered in ice, how many of us could actually survive that? Or if it were no ice at all, how many of us could survive that?
Oh, actually, humans, thinking that humans can't adapt to like 2 degrees of warming is pretty crazy. I mean, we've put, men on the moon. Okay, we send people to Antarctica. People live in the extreme heat of the Middle East. We've managed to adapt to all this. So, this thinking that 2 degrees or 4 degrees or whatever is somehow going to do us in is fairly ridiculous.
But I'm talking about a
Um,
lot of degree change. Like, what if there's a massive, I mean, is the Earth headed for, maybe not in the next, 100 years or 1,000 years, but is the Earth headed towards a major climate change, a genuine major
okay,
climate change?
okay. I mean, if we had, okay, in the early 1800s, we had a cluster of a few extremely large volcanic eruptions, including the Tambor, excuse me, let me get my doggy. Okay. Say hi, Rosie. Okay. Oh, yeah, she's not doing so well, so she needs to be held. I'm sorry.
Oh, what a
Okay.
cutie.
Yeah, so this was when this erupted, it was a year without summer. It was so explosive and all of this junk made it up to the stratosphere, circled around the whole globe and really cooled off the climate. And then there were several other really big eruptions, decades. And this caused like a half a degree cooling over a period of decades. In the 1300s, there was an even bigger volcanic eruption, the Somelos one. And if that were to happen in the 21st century, it would send the temperatures back to pre-industrial for a few decades. So there's also, I mean, the natural forces in play are so much stronger and potentially much bigger changes than this slow creep of warming from fossil fuel emissions. So if anything is really bad is going to happen in the 21st century regarding the climate, I don't think it's going to be from fossil fuel emissions. It's probably going to be from um, something natural. The one impact that you have to worry about from warming is a potential collapse of the West Antarctic ice sheet. It's a very unstable ice sheet. If the ice sheet was gone, it would, the continent's underwater. So it's just a very unstable ice sheet. And they say, oh, well, warming can make this more unstable. What can really make it unstable is that there's under ice volcanoes. If any of those get very active, then that can really accelerate the instability of the West Antarctic ice sheet. So by focusing on this one single thing, the slow creep of warming from associated with fossil fuel emissions, I mean, we could be missing, the main point
Yeah.
of what we should be worrying about in the 21st century regarding
What
climate variability.
what could we even do about that? I mean, we can't stop volcanoes.
No, we can't. Okay, what we can do is if we're wealthy, we can figure out how to adapt to anything. If we have enough electricity, if we have enough wealth, we can manage. I mean, you can grow plants indoors. In the Netherlands, they feed most of Europe, and what they do is they grow plants indoors, greenhouses and vertical farming and everything. Um, so there's lots of things that we can do um, with technology and advancing technologies, but we have to, and the wealthier countries and people are able to adapt much more easily than poor countries. And you have to have abundant electricity in order to do any of this. So efforts to sabotage our energy infrastructure and replace it all with wind and solar is not going to help our resilience to whatever the Earth system plans to throw our way.
Interesting. So you think that we're actually setting ourselves up for disaster by trying to combat human-made climate change?
Oh, I'm all in, if you with nuclear power, I think that's a very good solution. I think geothermal is a very good solution. I'm all in favor of cleaner power, but we have to recognize that it's going to take all of the 21st century to make this transition. All these deadlines like 2030 and 2050 are just meaningless. They're not going to happen. Okay, we need to develop better technologies. Who wouldn't want more abundant cheaper, more reliable, and cleaner energy. We all want that. The question is, we need to, the emphasis has to be on abundant and secure. And wind and solar cannot provide that. And so all the money we're sinking into that is 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 delaying, you know, and
Yeah.
wasting money when we could be spending it on developing better solutions. And nuclear power is the obvious one. And, it takes a while for all that to happen. And we just have to acknowledge that.
Okay, so let's just say if we were to get to net zero, if humans were able to just suddenly by 2030 completely cut our carbon emissions, we're doing absolutely everything that the climate alarmists are saying that, they're saying it's an existential crisis. We must do XYZ thing and we must do it now. We don't have time to waste. We want to ban coal mining. We want to ban gas cars. We want to ban all of these things. Let's just say we do it. What kind of impact would that at least slow this potential disaster? I hear you that you're saying that the natural disasters are going to be worse than any human-made disaster. So we should be, gearing up and understanding that the natural volcanic activity is going to probably do way more damage than any humans could do. But let's just say humans are, if we are contributing to 20 to 30%, that it is causing warming by a couple of degrees. If we were to stop, how much time would we buy ourselves, I suppose, before we got to this point where it was a true emergency?
Okay, there's really long time scales involved. Like the sea levels would keep rising, for centuries. The time scales in the oceans are very slow. We might not notice anything, in all honesty, until the 22nd century because the natural climate variability is so large. It would be hard to tell. In the 21st century. So we're not going to see any benefits to the climate or reduced extreme events in the 21st century. But the worst place we could possibly be in, let's say the climate alarmists are right, that we're going to see 10 degrees of warming by 2100. And the worst thing that could happen to the worst situation for us if we're facing that kind of warming without air conditioning, without all the things and desalination and all the things that abundant electricity would provide. So to me, it's a lose-lose. This rapid transition. There's just no urgency. Okay. Now, in my book, I have a new book, Climate Uncertainty and Risk, and it'll be coming out in June. And a big part of that is how we've mischaracterized the climate risk. We've conflated the slow creep of warming, which is something that, sea level rise and all that, with the emergency risk from extreme weather. And CO2 emissions have little to nothing to do with that. So if you drop the emergency risk from extreme weather as part of the motivator for the urgency, then you have plenty of time to figure out how to do this right, where we can slowly move towards cleaner energy and reducing our emissions while maintaining our energy security, abundance, and reliability. And in the short term, we're going to need more energy for the energy transition. Electric vehicles, heat pumps, all that is using a lot more electricity that electric utilities aren't really prepared for. And this was evident in the Christmas time cold event when the Tennessee Valley Authority had blackouts because the demand was 20% higher than they expected because they weren't aware of all these heat pumps, electric heat pumps for heating. So we're going to need more electricity. So trying to kneecap the fossil fuel industry right now makes no sense because we really need more energy to fuel this transition. The amount of energy required to build and install one of those offshore wind turbines is incredible. There's some concern that over the life cycle of the wind turbine, it may not even pay back all the electricity used
Just
in
to
its
set it
building
up.
and its institution. I know.
Gosh,
So, we're
interesting.
just being stupid. And we're being stupid because of this urgent code red kind of rhetoric from the UN, which is echoed by certain politicians. And of course, the media loves it because it's clickbait. I mean, common sense and science have left the room on this issue.
Why do you think there is this alarmism then? Where is this coming from?
You have to go back to the 1980s. I mean, all this started with the UN Environmental Program, who was interested in promoting a global, non-governmental governance. They don't like fossil fuels. They don't like capitalism. And they seized on climate change as the ideal issue, the ideal vehicle for that. And that's when the IPCC got started in 1988, and then the UN Framework Convention in 1992 with the big climate treaty. So we had a big climate treaty, international climate treaty in 1992, and the US even signed on. And this was before there was any evidence of human-caused warming other than theoretical and in some very early climate models. Even the first assessment report from the IPCC, published in 1990, basically said that, yeah, we've seen a little bit of warming, but it's not outside the range of natural variability. And that was the conclusion from the first assessment report. Nevertheless, the UN went ahead with this big international treaty to prevent dangerous anthropogenic climate change. So from the very beginning, we've seen the policy cart way out in front of the scientific horse, from the very beginning. And why people have bought into this, I just don't know. I just don't know.
Yeah, it's interesting then that this is, but what you're saying to me makes a lot of sense. I kind of find it hard to believe that humans could have that much control over weather or climate. It just seems like weather and climate is extremely powerful. We can't even predict the weather accurately, let alone control it. But I've certainly, and over the years, just anecdotally in my own life, I feel like we have cleaner air now than we did back in the 80s. Just flying into Los Angeles in the 80s, I would just see brown smog covering the city. And now it's not as bad. Things seem to be getting better. People are driving cleaner cars. We have moved to more solar energy. We have made shifts, I feel, that have contributed to cleaning up the environment in a lot of ways. And so, it seems like we're making progress, but then we're being told, no, we're not. We're not making any progress. In fact, things are worse and they're more dire than ever.
Okay, now I want to pick up on one point that you made about like that we can't control that. I mean, they're trying to control the weather and climate. Not going to happen, folks. I mean, we should be trying to, I mean, this is like COVID. We couldn't control it. I mean, at best, we could hope to manage it. So, the climate variability and change is an ongoing predicament. It's going to happen whether it's human cause or natural variability. We're going to have bad weather. We need to figure out how to better manage all this, not control it, understand it, and manage it. So, I mean, this whole UN thing about controlling and all these deadlines and emissions targets and this, that, and then the tragedy. Okay, 2 days ago, I participated in a conference with African women, trying to motivate female entrepreneurship and STEM education in Africa. And the most criminal thing about all this is they won't let Africa develop their own fossil fuel resource sources so they can develop. I mean, they're still, all of their farming is done by hand. On and on it goes. It's absolutely criminal. And then the worst thing is they're exploiting that. There's a lot of oil and natural gas resources in Africa. They can't afford to, to get the burners and to actually use it and the infrastructure to use it in country. So they're being exploited, and all of that natural gas and oil is being sold to Europe and Asia, particularly with the situation in Russia and Ukraine. So they're being exploited. Their resources are being exploited, and nobody will lend them the money to actually develop a capability to develop an energy infrastructure. I mean, that's the most criminal thing about all these stupid targets and deadlines.
Yeah, I've felt the same way. There have been actually many countries, actually many of the BRICS nations that are together now that have been saying for years that a lot of the climate rhetoric is really just an attack on them from developing. It's to prevent them, prevent Brazil, prevent India, prevent China from developing into countries that would rival the West. And they've been saying that for a while. And that's kind of the first that it kind of sparked my intrigue because again, so many of us, we're not scientists. This is kind of what happened during COVID. A lot of people, not scientists, just trusted what was said by the media when they said, all the doctors say do this, all the scientists say this. And then you just say, okay, I guess, I'm not the doctor, I'm not the scientist, so I guess I'll just believe it because I've got other things to worry about in my life. And I think many of us have felt that way, but that was the first time for me that I began to question. I've never bought into the climate, or I should say recently, when I was very young, yeah, but recently I haven't bought into it as much because I've just thought, I don't know either way. I'm not a scientist, so it's hard for me to say, yes, this is absolutely true. It's also hard for me to say, no, it isn't. And so I've been keeping a very open mind about what is really going on when it comes to climate change and how much are people driving it. But what really sparked that was these poorer nations that are developing saying this is just an attack on us. This is nothing but that. This is rhetoric that is being used to keep certain countries powerful and other countries down.
Um, I agree on one level, but when it comes to Africa and really the poorest of the poor nations, I mean, nobody's worried about a near-term threat from these countries. But they're not, what used to be development from the World Bank and all these other organizations that used to help countries, develop, all of that money is now tied. You can't get any development money unless you're, using it for wind and solar or something like that,
Right.
clean energy. It's all tied up, and that's not going to help them. You can't build an economy on wind and solar power. And, so all of the development money is dried up because it's being redirected towards reducing emissions. I mean, all of this has just become, stupid land.
Yeah. Well, I mean, China has been going in there and trying to develop Africa. And so part of it could be an
China,
attack on
China's the only
trying to
one doing it.
prevent
Yeah.
China. Yeah.
Well, then
Um,
there's various exploitative issues with regards to, loans and agreements, that
any
they're
any
committing to.
major country that goes in and tries to yeah, I mean
Exploit.
everybody's got their own agenda. Sure, everybody's got they've got something to benefit from that arrangement for sure. They're very I don't know if anything's ever done in the goodwill of a larger nation anymore. We say, oh, it's for humanitarian reasons, and it's like, oh, sure. Um, so what? So you clearly do think that people should shift energy sources, right? That we should be moving away from fossil fuels.
Well, the bigger issue is we need a 21st century energy infrastructure that's better than what we have. Okay, there are issues with fossil fuels. At some point, it's going to get very expensive to extract them. There's price fluctuations. There's a lot of geopolitical instability associated with them because certain countries have a lot of resources that are not necessarily friendly to the West, and on it goes. So there's reasons to transition, apart from pollution and that kind of thing. But my key issue is that we're going to need so much more energy in the 21st century. It's not just about replacing what we currently have with the inferior wind and solar. It's about, increasing by orders of magnitude. Apart from electrifying Africa and things like that, all of our innovations and our movement forward as a human race is going to rely on electricity, blockchain technology and robotics and artificial intelligence and quantum this and on it goes, and advanced materials. All of these things are enabled by electricity. If we're stymieing our electricity supply or it's very expensive, these are advancements that are not going to be made. And so it's, by restricting near-term energy supplies and, trying to kneecap the fossil fuel industry, we're placing a tourniquet around our neck in the near term. By all means, let's develop new, cleaner technologies, but forget these crazy deadlines and acknowledge that it's going to take all of the 21st century to make this transition in a way that minimizes land use and resources while maximizing the amount of energy that we have at a very low cost, hopefully.
So, what would you say? Are there scientists who you respect who take an opposite viewpoint of you and they say, no, this is absolutely an emergency. We must do something about this now. We must be banning all of these fossil fuels. We've got to get on it. We've got to get on it now.
Um, there's a whole spectrum of scientists. I mean, the ones who speak loudly about reducing fossil fuels, I mean, it's pure activism. They don't really understand the policy process. They don't really understand the technologies. They don't understand about the asynchronicity of wind and solar and how that messes up the grid. There's all sorts of technical reasons not to be adding wind and solar in a big way to the grids. They simply don't understand this. So people who speak out publicly, sometimes it's just politics and there's no depth of knowledge there about societal issues. I mean, the whole issue, the most extreme scenarios are now off the table. I mean, the UN and everybody agrees with that. There's still debates about climate sensitivity and what's going to happen with extreme events and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, we're talking about a few degrees more warming over the 20th century, not the 10 degrees that people were talking about even 5 years ago. So, the worst scenarios are off the table. And so continuing to amp up the alarm to promote rapid transition to wind and solar, just makes no sense. So if anybody's promoting that, I'm just saying, well, you haven't thought hard enough about all this.
So there are some countries and areas of the world that are very worried about climate change. It's something that they talk often about. In Italy, for example, they're really worried that their country is sinking. Florida is also worried that that it's a state that's sinking. Even Ron DeSantis, though he is a more libertarian Republican governor, when he got into office in Florida, created a climate change committee to watch the levels, the ocean levels in Florida. That was like a shock to people on the left that a Republican governor would do this. So there are some areas of the world that are very worried about
Okay.
the rising oceans and that what it would do to
Okay.
their
Let me talk
populations in their
about
cities. New York City, for example, as well.
the rising ocean is one thing. It's rising at 3 millimeters per year. If you stack two pennies on top of each other, that's 3 millimeters. That's how much the ocean is rising each year.
But
Okay.
eventually, a stack of pennies is a lot. I mean, you keep stacking them and stacking them and stacking them. You do
I know,
that for 100,
yeah,
for
I
50
know, but
years
in
even.
100 years, it's not very much. It's like a foot. Okay, and that's not very much. Now, the bigger issue, and this is some of the Southeast Asian cities, especially, they're sinking like crazy, like at 30 times the rate of sea level rise. And the reason they're sinking is mainly due from they're withdrawing groundwater, and then they have all these buildings, and then it just gets compacted. I mean, the Philippines, the capital is no longer Jakarta. They've moved it inland to another city whose name I can't even remember. The problem with um, New Orleans is also
Yeah.
sinking far more than the sea level is rising. Now, Florida isn't sinking. Okay, what they're facing is they just have fundamentally low elevation. I mean, most of the state's elevation is less than 6 feet, so they can't accommodate very much of a sea level rise. And a lot of those nice places, like the ones that got wiped out in the hurricane, like Fort Myers Beach and those kind of places. They're basically glorified sandbars. They're not permanent geological structures. They come and go. So there's a lot of the coastal area of Florida that's very susceptible to many things, not just mostly to hurricanes, more so than global warming. So
But the
The
climate,
biggest
they would say that the hurricanes are because of the global warming.
No, we've had the worst hurricanes. No, the worst Florida landfalling hurricane was in 1935, far and away the worst one. Okay, the more recent ones, I'm not even sure they make the top 10. They're very bad ones in the first half of the 20th century that were stronger than ones that we've seen. Um, so, thinking that hurricanes, in the 20s, okay, there were crazy ones. And there was a big land boom, in the early 1920s, and then they had a big hurricane the Great Miami Hurricane that wiped out Miami. Then they had another one 2 years later that flooded Lake Okeechobee, and the water just flooded everywhere and wiped out all of South Florida, and that ended the Florida land boom. Okay, and nothing much happened in Florida. Population slowly increased, and then I'm not sure what year it was. I think it was in the 1970s. Hurricane Frederick struck the Alabama, Mississippi coast, and then FEMA came in and reimbursed all the property owners for their losses. And so people said, oh, well, no problem. Let's go develop Florida because the feds will bail us out. Following Hurricane Andrew in 1992, which wiped out Miami, the director of the National Hurricane Center testified before Congress saying that the FEMA bailing out of people with hurricane damage contributed to the amount of development and the subsequent damage from Hurricane Andrew. So there you have it. Hurricanes are nothing new to Florida. They were much worse in the first part of the 20th century. And FEMA and the US government has created a moral hazard by saying, well, it's okay to build there. We'll bail you out if you get destroyed by a
Right.
hurricane.
Right.
So, don't blame it on fossil fuels.
Yeah, there's definitely something about humans kind of building and inhabiting areas that are really, it's not a good idea. It's like, okay, this is a fire zone. Maybe
Well,
don't
well,
build in a
people are,
fire zone.
well, there's no way that people are going to abandon the Florida beaches. I mean, just no
Right.
way. The point is you either have to make the structures exceptionally strong or you have to build really cheap stuff, and expect it to last 20 years. And if it get wiped out, then you just rebuild. The first time I visited the Florida Keys, and this is probably maybe the 70s or 80s, there were no big, they're just a bunch of shanties. Because they knew they were going to get wiped out by hurricanes. Now you go there, there's high rises and wealthy homes and everything all over the place. Well, oh boy. Um, that's probably not a great idea unless the
Right.
construction is extremely strong. Now, some of the new construction in Florida is extremely strong and it can withstand hurricanes, with minimal damage. But most of it takes a long time to replace all that
Right.
building
Well, and it just seems
stock.
unrealistic to tell people, ultimately, yeah, there are fire zones, there's hurricane zones. It's maybe not the wisest idea, but at the same time, I live in California where it's an earthquake. The whole state's an earthquake zone. It seems like it's impossible to escape being in some sort of area where you're going to have a natural disaster. So humans just have to, I don't know if there is any region in the world where it's just safe from natural disaster. I'm not certain of that.
What happened? Now, okay, so my sister lives in Fort Myers Beach. Okay, she lived on the second floor of a condo. Her little condo unit was okay, but the lower level was wiped out. And she can move back later in the summer, but there's nothing that's going to keep her away. She loves it there. She's going back there. But she said that the reconstruction, the town square is almost all back. It's being put together very quickly. They said the thing that's slowing it down is some of the insurance companies are slow to pay out, but
Right.
it's being rebuilt very quickly. Okay, a wealthy place like Florida can survive these things. Haiti, not at
Right.
all.
Right.
Hurricane comes in and it just wipes everything out, and the continued cycle of these storms is relentlessly impoverishing. But wealth is our best protection
Interesting.
against these storms and climate change.
Interesting. And we can only gain that by having energy. We need energy to
Yeah,
create
without
wealth.
electricity, our wealth is going to go down the tubes. Yeah.
Yeah. So what has your life been like since you've kind of become this, I guess, you're not, you're clearly not a denial, you're not denying global warming or climate change, I should say. You're clearly saying, yeah, it's happening. It's just not to the level that the alarmists are making it sound. Yeah, humans are contributing to it, but again, not to the level that it should be creating a crisis, or this is the existential threat that we must do XYZ thing in order to stop. You're more of a contrarian, I suppose, just because you're asking some of these questions or bringing up these points. How has your life changed because of that?
Okay, well, first off, I'm a scientist at heart. It's in my blood. Okay, it's my job to question the evidence, to challenge the assumptions, and reevaluate the conclusion. That's what I do. Okay, and I retired prematurely from academia, the university, because it was too groupthinky, too politicized, too siloed, and cancel culture was starting in at the university. I said, I don't need to be here. I'm out of here. So I left. I'm in the private sector, and I couldn't be happier. I'm helping real people, real companies, government agencies understand and manage their weather and climate related risks. So, I'm in the trenches with people making real decisions. I'm not just an ivory tower academic person who publishes papers and then issues a press release and then um, put my head down when my paper doesn't even survive, 1 week following its press release. There's real consequences if I'm wrong, if I give overconfident predictions that turn out to be wrong. I mean, my clients will desert me. I mean, I have real skin in the game, unlike people in the universities. So coming from a completely different perspective at this point than academic climate scientists.
So, which is, I think, a good thing. Who would you say when you're working with, you say, these government agencies and these businesses? Who would you say, because it just seems like the climate change narrative is really just one-sided. It's like in unison, everyone is saying it's an existential threat. We must do something about it. So are you finding that there are certain governments or agencies that are a bit more reasonable than others? Are they actually listening to you, or are they just saying, nope, the science is settled, 97% agree that climate change is
Okay.
an existential crisis?
Okay, the lower down on the food chain you go, the more somebody is likely to listen to me, like a municipality who's worried about their local sea level rise. They don't care what the consensus is. They want to know what's the evidence for or against, what's the plausible worst case scenario, what's the most likely scenario, on and on. They have real decisions to make. They're not worried about the politics or consensus or anything. They want to see the data. They want it clearly explained. They want to understand my evaluation of the projections, and on it goes. So they have real decisions, that are close to their heart, unlike federal politicians, people in the Senate or whatever, it's just political bloviating. So real decision, when money's on the line. Okay, with like asset management funds, I have a number of clients who are like investment managers and asset management funds, and they need to understand the real risk because people are putting a lot of money on the line. And if they're not giving a realistic risk assessment to their investors are going to bail. So they've got a very, it doesn't, forget consensus, forget whatever. What's going to happen in the next 5 years? What's the worst that can happen? Are there, the kinds of decisions that they're faced with? I give them a realistic assessment. So it's very different. They don't care that much about the politics, and they like that I'm an outside the box thinker. They know what everybody else is saying. They want a different perspective, and they want me to explain to them why what I'm saying, how and why what I am saying is different from what the mainstream narrative is. And if people are carefully reading the IPCC reports, like the Working Group 1 report, which remains fairly objective, Most of what I say is very consistent with what is in that IPCC Working Group 1 assessment. So it's nothing out there scientifically, no secret anything. It's just a more realistic assessment of the natural weather and climate variability in context of this slow creep of warming. This is what I bring to my clients so they have a better understanding of their near-term risk. Most of them don't care about 2100. They care about 5 years from now, maybe 30 years from now. So that's the time scale that I operate in mostly.
Hmm. What would you say, as we wrap up here, what would you say to the people that are saying, no, absolutely, climate change is an existential threat, it's an emergency? What would you say to them to convince them that it is not the emergency they think it is? That yes, it's happening, but it's not an emergency.
Well, I took my best shot at it in an op-ed that I had published in the Australian last Monday in terms of trying to convince them. Basically showed how all this had become politicized and divorced from the science. And I talked about how the climate crisis isn't what it used to be, rejecting of the extreme emission scenarios, and on it goes. It seems to resonate with how would I say, a more educated or business-oriented population, you know, in the muddled middle, if you will, people who don't quite know what to think about all this. For younger people who aren't thinking but are just afraid, um, that's a little bit tougher. I've had a number of them contact me, and I've tried to explain to them, and I've written blog posts and tried to generate a discussion on all this. But the level of alarm that's being fed to kids and young adults is way worse than what we're seeing as adults. I mean, it's really bad. It's really scary. It's contributing to a lot of the depression amongst teenagers and young adults. All for what? um, to scare people, to get rid of fossil fuels so that we have inadequate electricity supply. I mean, it's just makes absolutely no sense. And you've got politicians, like in certain states making all these commitments, but they haven't talked to the engineers that actually run their electric utilities. I sit on a committee for one of the states that is very aggressive, with very aggressive goals by 2030. And I'm trying to help them understand the natural variability of weather. What happens when you have this big, cold, high pressure system in the winter that covers most of the continent? Okay, you have a cold wave, for 2 weeks, no wind. And you had a snowfall before that. So all the solar panels are covered. Okay, now where are you supposed to get your energy from? Okay, you can't get it from the neighboring states because they have the same conditions that you do. And this happens all the time, particularly in the Great Plains, the Midwest, the Northeast. And with this Christmas storm, it even made it down into the Southeast US. So this is what we have to worry about. And there's just no way you can deal with a situation like that solely with wind and solar. I mean,
Yeah.
it's a fairy tale.
So do you think that the climate conversation has gone very much in the same way that maybe the COVID conversation went, where there was a point when a lot of the doctors said, a lot of the scientists said, that there's certain things that you cannot change. There's no, there's certain things that we know, like natural immunity, for example. We know that there's a level of this that works for people. And so, but then suddenly during COVID, that was abandoned by many of the scientists that said, oh, no, the vaccine is the only way out. Do you feel like, and then now we've seen, and then there was this whole, the vaccine, if you don't believe in it, then you are, you're an anti-science person. If you think it doesn't stop the spread, of course it does. It's going to end the pandemic. And now here we are, so do you feel like it's been a very similar?
Oh, it's very similar. And the COVID, all of this is played out on the time scale of like 2 or 3 years, whereas climate, it's decades. You saw there were a lot of vested interests in certain drugs and in the vaccines, including Fauci, who gets royalties from all this stuff. There was cancel culture. Anybody who spoke up against, like, come on, we can't control this,
Right.
to just protect the elderly people and this kind of thing, that now seem like common sense. These people were canceled from social media. A few of them lost their university positions. I mean, this is like, some communist or crazy country. With the cancel culture, we should have had debate about all of these things rather than we were fed misinformation. We were fed stuff that they even knew was misinformation. All these people, any kind of dissent, looking at the Twitter files and what was going on during COVID. I mean, it's frightening that that's going on in this country. These really complicated issues, we need to have public debate, and we need to let a wide range of experts have their say, and we need to critically evaluate them. The main thing about these complex issues is we need to abandon the idea that we can control them. We can't control them. We can try to understand them, and we can work to manage these risks. But we need to abandon this idea of control. It's sending us in some very, very dangerous directions as a society.
So you think Bill Gates' plan to create a big cloud that can block the sun is a bad idea? I take
Right?
it.
Bad idea. It's a bad idea.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like the last thing we need is him in charge of another way to save humanity from some crisis that's happened. Unfortunately for you, with COVID, like you said, it played out really quickly, right? This was a 2 to 3 year thing. And we could see, and I was one of the people that was very much from the very beginning saying, this is insane. Like, what are we doing? This is absolutely insane. And I was very alone in that. And then slowly over the years, more and more people joined. They realized, yeah, wait, maybe this is insane. This isn't the right way. And so they would join in. And it happened very rapidly. Luckily, it happened very, very rapidly, where now we're 3 years later, and the majority of people at this point say, okay, now they're saying things that I've been saying for 3 years, but they're acting like they've said it for 3 years almost. Like, well, of course the vaccines don't stop the spread, but that's not what they were made for. And it's like, well, that's not what you were saying last year. Last year you were telling me I had to take it or else. But we've seen this happen really quickly. Climate change, on the other hand, they keep giving us these long timelines. So unfortunately for someone like you that has been labeled as this, climate change denier, conspiracy theorist type, you've been kind of labeled in that same camp that I've been labeled when it comes to COVID. Unfortunately for you, it doesn't play out as quickly. The wait and see is not a matter of couple of months or years like it's been with COVID. With me, it was like, wait and see. I know the vaccine doesn't stop the spread. It didn't take long for that to come to pass and for people to realize that. But for you, this is going to be a much longer, this is much,
In
much
another
longer.
5 years, in another 5 years, people will realize that wind and solar aren't going to cut it. There's a few places that are being very aggressive. South Australia may be the most aggressive place right now for very rapid. And if you can't do wind and solar in Australia, you can't do it anywhere. They've got lots of wind, they've got lots of sun, but they're running into all sorts of problems. And the only thing that's bailing them out in any way, it's really crazy expensive electricity. It's intermittent. The only thing that's bailing them out is when they can transmit coal-generated electricity from the neighboring state. I mean, it's just
Yeah.
not working. There's so many, and I give them credit. They're grappling with all the technological problems. So because of the deadlines, it's just putting Band-Aids here and Band-Aids there, and it's not.
But like we saw with
Maybe it
COVID,
can work.
I
Yeah.
mean, what they're going to do is they'll just shift the narrative a bit. So, they'll keep shifting the narrative for a while before they finally admit, okay, fine, I give up. And that's ultimately what did happen with COVID. But we saw the shift, even with just like the vaccines. It was take the vaccine; it's going to end the pandemic. Then it was okay, it doesn't stop the spread, but take it because it'll prevent you from getting sick and you won't miss work. You won't even feel it. And then they saw, oh, I still get sick and I'm still down and out. Okay, fine, take it and you won't die. They keep moving the goalposts. So I think when it comes to climate change, it'll be that same thing. If they say, oh, yeah, well, wind and solar is not really working, crap. Okay, well, they'll make just another excuse. I just don't see this. I don't see this ending anytime soon. I don't see this narrative or this alarmism, I should say, and this attempt to control climate, I don't see this ending anytime soon, unfortunately.
Well, reality, the climate, the weather and climate at some point, we've had like since 2016, we've had a spate of more extreme weather than we saw. It was very quiet between 2006 and 2016. Now we've had a bubble of, I mean, it'll die back down again, and then that'll slow it down. A decent sized volcanic eruption could slow this down. And so nature will sort of take the edge off of it at some point, and also reality will get in the way. Once they hand this over to the engineers who have to actually operate the grid and whatever, we're going to see that this just isn't going to work.
Yeah.
And so hopefully, I mean, let's spend our money on better technologies, on advanced nuclear and new geothermal technologies and whatever ideas other people have. And let's, forget about the emissions targets and all that. Let's have this be an R&D period, develop let the learning curves play out. And the things that will survive will be the ones that use the least amount of resources. Sorry. Okay. The ones that use the least amount of resources. And so we'll just have to see how it shakes out. But by put all our eggs in this basket and endlessly subsidizing wind and solar, we are not helping the natural evolution of how this 21st century energy transition could proceed.
Yeah, you bring up, I mean, this is a great conversation. Thank you so much for having it with us. I think that I think there needs to be, and I've always felt this way, that there needs to be a shift in focus. And that is, if this is going to happen, whether it's man-made or natural, we've got to give people the resources to combat it, people the resources to survive it, I should say. And one of the things that I find to be also very criminal is, in a way, we now have borders, right? Nation borders, and we say to people, you're not allowed to leave. You can't immigrate from this part of the world to this part of the world, which humans have always been natural migration. We are migrating, a migrating species. We move around. If there's a drought, if a fire or hurricanes or something happens, people naturally would then move to a different part of the world that they felt was safer and better. And we've now limited that ability for people to move around by creating these borders, these artificial, arbitrary borders, and saying you're not allowed to cross here without getting in trouble. You get deported, you're going to end up in jail, or something's going to happen to you bad if you make this illegal cross over this imaginary border. And so we're preventing people from being able to migrate away from the areas that they don't want to live in anymore because they're not so habitable, or even moving to areas where are more habitable suddenly because of the change in climate. Suddenly an area is better for living than it was previously. And these are the conversations, and you're right, having a lot of energy, making sure that areas that are poor like Haiti are no longer poor so they can survive hurricanes the same way Florida can survive hurricanes. These are great conversations that we should be having, but instead the narrative has just been one thing, and that is ban fossil fuels and do absolutely everything we can to ban fossil fuels. And I do think that is a no matter what, no matter whether it be, because again, I'm not a scientist, so I can't say either way like you can. You're very definitive in your conviction of this is the way that it is. No matter what, whether it be one way or the other, the conversation absolutely needs to shift. That needs to happen. And it is very focused on, just like the vaccine was the only way. We're only going to get out of COVID with the vaccine. They're saying the same thing. Ending fossil fuels is the only way. And yeah, I think many of us are calling bullshit on that. And we just don't feel like that this is an honest conversation in good faith that's actually looking to help people survive, help people get through what is going to be inevitable for all of us. Natural disasters happen to everyone, climate change or not. And, it's good that you're bringing these discussions forward. Unfortunately for you, it comes with the cost of being smeared and demonized by people. But bravely, thank you for being a contrarian. I think we need to hear other opinions, no matter what, whether we agree with them or not. We need to hear the other perspectives from reputable scientists like yourself. That is the most important thing. And I think more and more people now are willing to do that. So that, I think, is the good news. I think that especially after COVID, a lot more people are saying, wait a minute, what else have I believed that maybe I shouldn't be believing? And I think this is one of those things. So Judith Curry, thank you so much for being here and having this conversation.
Well, thanks much, Kim.
Well, guys, that was a really great conversation, and it definitely brings up a lot of questions that we should be answering. We should be having more conversations about all of this stuff when it comes to science. We definitely need to be having those. Thank you so much for joining. We will be back Monday. I hope you have a great weekend. We will be here same time, same place with another great show. Until then, have a great weekend and have a great night. Bye-bye.